Just a quick disclaimer before we get started. The views and opinions expressed as part of this presentation are those of the presenters and do not necessarily represent those of our funders or other organizations. Acknowledged.
I'm Ashley Wettlaufer. I'm a research methods specialist here at CAMH at the WHO Collaborating Centre in Toronto, and I work on the CAPE project as a research methods specialist, collecting data and helping score the provinces, territories, and federal government. Go ahead, Colin.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Colin Angus. I'm a professor of alcohol policy at the University of Sheffield. I have been quite heavily involved in the sort of history of minimum unit pricing. I did quite a lot of the modelling work for particularly the Scottish government, sort of prior to the implementation of minimum unit pricing, and have been involved in the evaluation of it and various bits and bobs in some of the other countries that we'll talk about in a little bit. Wolf?
Hi, yeah, I'm Wolf Livingston, Professor of Alcohol Studies at Wrexham University in Wales. I'm also a registered and qualified social worker and actively practice with those that drink and use other drugs. And I've been involved particularly in Scotland in the qualitative work associated with and quantitative work associated with treatment drinking populations. And then we're responsible for the overall evaluation and other projects within Wales, and have also spent some time in both Northern and Southern Ireland talking to them about policy implementation there too.
Great, Tina, if we could have the next slide. Perfect. So good afternoon, everyone. Like I said, I'm Ashley Wettlaufer. I'm a research methods specialist at CAMH, and through my work on the CAPE project, I started to get really interested in the nuances of alcohol pricing across Canada. And through this project is where I started to learn just how complex our pricing system for alcohol is at the different levels of government and the ways in which we implement these policies. We're going to hear some great presentations about minimum pricing, but first I just wanted to touch very briefly upon why we focus on price policy. So why do we care so much about the price of alcohol? International research shows that alcohol pricing is a very powerful policy tool. The evidence has repeatedly shown that increasing the price of alcohol has an impact on consumption, so how much people drink, and a range of harms that they experience at the population level, so across the population. Pricing measures increase the cost of alcohol, which decreases the affordability and the demand for these products. There are many different price policies that can be implemented by various levels of government. One of these many policies are minimum prices, which is what we're talking about today. So minimum prices set a floor price below which a specific volume of beverage, so liters of beer, or volume of ethanol, so number of standard drinks or number of units, cannot be sold. So it sets a floor price below which alcohol cannot be sold. Compared to taxation, this policy is often more amenable to industry since it's a form of revenue generation. In the case of an alcohol monopoly, which we still have in many jurisdictions in Canada, that revenue could go to government and help offset the costs of the harms from alcohol. Minimum pricing can also be tailored to target certain populations or products. For example, minimum prices increase the price of the cheapest alcohol, so those sitting at the floor price, and thus are particularly effective in targeting heavier drinkers who tend to consume the cheaper beverage types. Next slide, please. For the third iteration of CAPE, we assessed the implementation of a range of pricing policies against best practices for protecting public health. One of the most impactful policies we assessed were minimum price policies. The provinces and territories were assessed on whether minimum prices for on-premise sales, so restaurants and bars, and off-premise sales, so the retail outlets, whether they met a range of criteria. And so we looked at whether minimum prices were applied to products across the board, so all alcohol sales with no exception. And exceptions that we noted or looked for included discounting of gift certificates, delisting products and deeply discounting them, implementing volume discounts, so those like 2-for-1 deals, or cheaply priced large quantities, so like vats of wine, for example, or boxed wine. Cross promotions or value-added promotions, which we're seeing more of in the grocery stores. So these are promotions that offset the cost of alcohol below the level of the minimum price. So for example, buying a bottle of wine and getting $5 off a cut of meat in the grocery store. We also looked at whether the minimum price was set at an ideal rate that effectively deters consumption, and whether the minimum prices were updated annually according to inflation. So it's one thing to set a minimum price, but we were looking to see if those were updated to inflation so that they didn't lose their value over time. And finally, whether the minimum price was tied to the ethanol content, which we refer to as a minimum unit price, which we'll be hearing more about in the presentations. And so whether this price was tied to the ethanol content of the beverage was something we also evaluated. For the federal government, the CAPE assessment looked at whether the federal government at a minimum sets a minimum price for federally controlled lands, and whether they or whether they set price incentives or budget incentives rather for the jurisdictions at the P&T level to set a minimum price. Neither of these policies were implemented at the federal level, so we don't really need to go into the findings there, but we will talk more in detail on the next slide, please, of the minimum price policies at the provincial and territorial level. So here are the minimum prices calculated for the CAPE 3 assessment, and they're based on 2021 price policies. So we see in this table, if we look across both on-premise and off-premise, the territories don't have minimum prices in place for any alcohol sold either from restaurants and bars or from retail outlets. Alberta only has minimum pricing for on-premise sales, and Quebec has minimum pricing for a very limited range of products, so malt-based products for off-premise grocery store sales only. In terms of the level of minimum price, we see that PEI, Nova Scotia, and Newfoundland had the highest overall minimum price for off-premise sales, and BC had the highest minimum prices for on-premise establishments, so those restaurants and bars. And in fact, the BC minimum prices for each beverage type exceeded the recommended level. Also of note, but not necessarily evident in the table, is that Manitoba has a nearly perfect volumetric pricing for off-premise minimum prices. So they do set a minimum price per liter of ethanol. However, they adjust their minimum price by container size. So what ends up happening is there's these volume discounts because the minimum unit price is actually lower for larger container sizes. And then in Ontario, Saskatchewan, and Newfoundland, they loosely tie the minimum price to ethanol content. And they do this by setting a minimum price for products according to these broad strength bands. So the price per liter of products, so liter of beer, increases as you jump from one range of strength band to the next. So as the products get stronger, the price changes. Only Nova Scotia and New Brunswick index all off-premise minimum prices to keep pace with inflation, and Ontario does this for all products except for beer, and I'll get back to that point in a second. No province indexes the on-premise minimum prices automatically to keep pace with inflation. So although they set a minimum price for on-premise restaurants and bars, that price is only updated on an ad hoc basis and very infrequently in most cases. So while other parts of the globe are moving forward with minimum pricing, and we'll hear about that in more detail in a second, from the different iterations of CAPE, we see an erosion of minimum price policies overall across Canada. And just to give some more dramatic examples, I'll look to Ontario. So specifically, we see the effect of the buck a beer policy in Ontario that was brought in August of 2018. If we look on the off-premise minimum pricing, we see that beer rates for Ontario are one of the lowest minimum prices on the board. And because we've stopped indexing those, they sit at $1 plus the deposit fee. So they have not changed since 2018. So that also erodes that value of minimum price over time as other goods become relatively more expensive. Similarly, we saw a 33% decrease in on-premise minimum prices for spirits in Ontario between 2017 and 2021. And following a campaign of our newly elected Premier of Ontario, they campaigned on the elimination of minimum retail prices altogether in Ontario. So we await to see what happens with minimum prices more broadly in Ontario. So rather grim picture for minimum pricing, specifically in Ontario, but we will now hear from our other speakers on the implementation of minimum unit pricing in Scotland, Ireland, and Wales, where we see great examples of this policy. Turn it over to the other speakers. Go ahead.
Okay, can you see my slides all right? Okay, so yeah, I'm going to talk about the international evidence beyond Canada in terms of minimum pricing. So if we start off with just a quick 101, as Ashley's just said, a minimum unit price is a floor price setting a minimum price level below which a fixed volume of alcohol, so for example, a unit, a standard drink, cannot be sold. And this is a specific version of a more general minimum price policy where the floor price refers to a fixed volume of product, not alcohol, as implemented in Canada, as Ashley has just spoken about. And in some provinces, you have a banded minimum price policy, which is closer to a minimum unit price, where the minimum price is linked to the alcoholic strength, but it still doesn't quite directly tie the floor price to the alcohol content. So that's the really important difference between a minimum price and a minimum unit price, is that the minimum unit price very clearly links that floor price to the alcohol content of every single product. So why do we think the minimum unit price should work? Right? Well, we know that increasing prices is one of the most effective ways of reducing alcohol consumption. And we also know that MUP only affects the price of the cheapest alcohol, with the biggest impact on the very cheapest products. So you'd expect MUP to lead to reductions in consumption among people who are drinking that very cheap alcohol, while having little or no impact on people who are buying more expensive alcohol. And often the kind of political argument, this is really important. In the UK context, a lot of the argument around minimum unit pricing was not wanting to penalise responsible, in inverted commas, drinkers. So that's kind of a really key feature of MUP, is that it doesn't affect the price of more expensive products. And that's in contrast to tax increases, which generally increase the price of all alcohol to a similar extent. So really integral to understanding the effects of MUP is understanding who buys the cheap alcohol. So we know that heavier drinkers are much more likely to buy their alcohol from shops, or buy a greater proportion of their alcohol from shops rather than pubs and bars. And even within the alcohol that you buy in shops, heavier drinkers consistently pay lower prices. And that's through a combination of choosing to buy cheaper products, but also volume discounts, because they're buying more. They can take advantage of the fact that, you generally get a cheaper price when you buy in bulk. We also know that lower income drinkers tend to pay lower prices on average than higher income drinkers. But really importantly, certainly across the UK, the price gradient across income groups, so the difference in prices paid between people with higher and lower incomes who are drinking at similar levels, is generally much shallower than the price gradient across drinker groups. So at the same level of income, heavier drinkers are paying much less than moderate drinkers, whereas at the same level of drinking, lower income drinkers are only paying slightly less than higher income drinkers. And we also know that the heaviest drinkers on the lowest incomes are the ones paying the lowest prices of all. They're the ones who are really seeking out the really high strength, cheap alcohol. So what that means, and that's really important, because if we look at this, which is sort of the distribution of alcohol harm in Scotland here, and we've got different levels of drinking. So moderate, that's the lightest drinkers on the left in the green, and then hazardous in the middle, harmful are the very heaviest drinkers on the right in red. And then within each drinker group, we've got these quintiles of deprivation. Basically, darker colors to the further right means higher levels of deprivation, lower socioeconomic position. And so you can see that the length of the bars is the rate of alcohol attributable deaths. And you can see that the harm is very concentrated in the heaviest drinkers, but very much so within the heaviest drinkers from the most deprived areas, right? So it's really a, as I'm sure many of you will be aware, it's really a problem of the heavy drinkers in the lowest socioeconomic groups who are suffering the alcohol harm. So in theory, MUP should be a targeted approach using prices, which we know are an effective tool for reducing consumption and harm, and which should have the biggest impact on heavier drinkers without penalizing moderate drinkers, and which should reduce health inequalities. So, is it the Holy Grail? Well, maybe not. So that's kind of the theory behind MUP. So let's talk a bit about the history of it. So here's a map showing all the countries in the world that have some form of minimum price. Although actually, as of the start of this month, Australia's Northern Territory revoked their minimum price. They elected a libertarian government who part of their manifesto was to remove minimum price. That's not because the evidence didn't show that it was effective, but just because they were ideologically opposed to minimum pricing and kind of, they're a libertarian government. They don't like interventionist public health policies. So I wouldn't necessarily view that as evidence that MUP failed in the Northern Territory, but it is, it is relevant that they don't have it anymore. So I guess there's a lot more red on this map than I would have thought when I first set out to try and draw it, right? So Canada, you guys were really the kind of the leaders for a long time, the only people that had any form of minimum pricing, in some cases banded minimum pricing. But from the 2000s and the 2010s, Russia and many former Soviet nations have had some form of minimum pricing. And these were generally either minimum prices or sometimes they were minimum unit prices, but they only affected some products and particularly spirits. So often the minimum price affected only spirits or even sometimes only vodka, which is, as I'm sure you'll be aware, particularly associated in Russia and former Soviet states with very, very high levels of consumption and problems. And then in 2018, Armenia and Scotland were the first countries in the world to introduce a comprehensive minimum unit price that affects all alcohol. And then shortly thereafter, Australia's Northern Territory introduced one in 2018, Wales in 2020, and the Republic of Ireland in 2022 have all followed suit in introducing a comprehensive minimum unit price affecting all alcohol. So if you just zoom in on the UK and Ireland, right, well, Scotland initially introduced an MUP of 50 pence per UK unit, which my math says is $1 Canadian $58 per Canadian standard drink. Wales introduced their MUP at the same level. Ireland introduced their MUP at €1 per Irish standard drink, which is $2 Canadian $20 per Canadian standard drink. So that's the only one that gets above Ashley's ideal level of off-premise MUP. And then Scotland has recently changed the level of their MUP from 50p per UK unit to 65p, which is $2.05. Northern Ireland has said that they want to introduce an MUP, but they don't have one yet. And England, well, we dallied with one back in 2014, but the legislation never got off the ground, and who knows what the new government might do. But something that's really important to understand the differences even between the UK nations, but certainly when you're thinking about international comparisons, is that all MUPs aren't equal to each other. So the impact that an MUP is going to have is going to depend on the distribution of prices before you introduce it and the level at which you set the MUP. So prior to MUP being introduced in Scotland, just under half of alcohol being sold in shops was being sold at less than the MUP level. In Australia's Northern Territory, that was much smaller. It was just under a fifth. Whereas in Ireland, it was much higher. It's harder to get really good data for Ireland, but my best guess is that it was around 80%. So it covered a much bigger proportion of the market that was affected. However, Scotland and Wales had white cider, which was a product which had particularly low tax rates, and so was much, much cheaper than everything else. Australia has cask wine that kind of fills a similar position in the market. It's much cheaper than everything else because it has a much lower rate of tax. And so when MUP came in, although it increased the prices of lots of products by a little bit, it increased the price of these particularly problematic products by a lot. However, Ireland didn't really have any one product that was much cheaper than the others because they had a much more sensible tax system. And so actually, although the Irish MUP covered a much bigger proportion of the market, it's increased everything, almost everything by a little bit, rather than some things by a lot. And that's a really important distinction that kind of has a really key role to play in terms of understanding the effects of MUP. And something else that's really important, Canada's the only country that's got separate higher minimum prices for the on-trade. Everywhere else that has a minimum price, the minimum price does apply in the on-trade, but the price threshold is set at a level such that it's basically going to have no impact on sales in pubs and bars because the price differential between shops and bars is so big. And in the UK, this isn't a kind of a bug. This is a feature. This is desirable because we love pubs and it's political suicide to do anything that might damage the Great British pub. So that's kind of a really important feature of MUP is that it only affects shops and doesn't affect pubs. Okay, so I'm just going to move on now to talk a bit about what's actually happened when MUPs come into force. I'm going to focus on Scotland because Scotland, as part of their legislation for MUP, introduced what they called a sunset clause. So they said, we'll introduce MUP, we'll have a really good evaluation of its effects over 5 years, and then after 5 years, we're going to have a report that summarizes all of this, and then the Parliament has to vote to keep it, or else we'll get rid of it. And so this is the final report that summed up all that evidence. There was over 40 separate studies, some of them directly commissioned by government, some conducted independently, using a huge range of methodologies in exploring all kinds of different outcomes. And really importantly, the evaluation was informed by a really detailed theory of change. So it set out from the beginning, this is the mechanism of effect. We expect that you introduce the minimum unit price, that's going to change the prices of shops in stores. That's going to change the amount of alcohol that people buy. That's going to change the amount of alcohol that people drink, and that's going to affect their health. And then, but then also kind of featuring all of the other potential outcomes or, potential effects, positive and negative, that you might expect to find. So then all of the research studies could be sort of evaluated against this theory of change to see how well they kind of supported it or maybe challenged it. So in terms of the steps of that, the market response to MUP, so compliance was very good, very strong qualitative and quantitative evidence that there wasn't really any alcohol being sold below the minimum price threshold once it came in. There was no evidence of people kind of selling it under the counter or anything like that. And this shows the distribution of prices in 2019, so after the MUP came in England and Wales in red and Scotland in kind of teal there. And you can see that there's a huge difference with lots of cheap alcohol still being sold in England and Wales and a huge spike in Scotland at 50p. There are a little bit of alcohol there recorded in the sales data at between 40 and 50p, but we think that's probably an error in the sales data rather than reflecting genuine sales. And there was some interesting evidence of market response through lower alcoholic strength versions of some products being launched, particularly the things like white cider and perry, which were being sold, that's kind of a pear cider, which were being sold well below the MUP level. So to try and kind of take some of the sting out the big price increase, the manufacturers cut the alcoholic strength at the same time. And they also, another way that they kind of addressed this was to put things in smaller containers. And some retailers just stopped stocking big bottles of high strength white cider because the price went from like £3 to £12, and no one was going to buy it for £12 when they could buy something else at the same price per unit. There was some evidence from interviews with the industry that we didn't see more change in product ranges. We didn't see more of this kind of market response reformulation because Scotland's a relatively small market, and so it wasn't cost effective to develop specific products for it. But if you have a bigger market, you might probably expect to see a bit more of this kind of thing going on. And then, crucially, the impact on alcohol sales. So this is how alcohol sales change proportionately for all the different kinds of alcohol. So on the left there is all alcohol. Overall alcohol sales fell by 3%. And you can see there is some variation. So on the far right-hand side, you can see cider and perry in the green there. Those are the products that were being sold well below the MUP level, so their price increased a huge amount. And so it's no surprise to see the sales falling a lot. But we also saw falls in the sales of spirits, beer, and premixed drinks. A small increase in sales of wine, which was generally not being sold very much below the MUP level. And that kind of eye-catching yellow bar, fortified wine, that's really driven by something like a really weird product called Buckfast, which is a caffeine-enhanced fortified wine, which actually was always being sold above the MUP level and was kind of the sales growth predated MUP. So that's not really an MUP effect. It's just kind of a weird Scottish thing. Okay, so we know that over alcohol sales went down, but what do we know about who reduced their drinking? Well, there were 21 different studies looking at alcohol consumption to some extent, which is great for people like me that want more data, but an absolute nightmare for public health messaging because there was inevitably some conflicting findings. And so I'm just going to recommend a couple of papers that tried to sort of summarize all of that evidence and make sense of it all, because it was complicated, and there are seeming conflicts in some of the studies, but actually when you understand the relative methodological strengths of them, there is a coherent picture that you can draw. And overall, the evidence suggests that heavier drinkers did reduce their consumption more than lighter drinkers, but it's less clear about the very heaviest drinkers in surveys reducing their drinking. And separate studies that I'm sure Wolf will talk about in a second, focusing on people engaging with treatment services, didn't find any consistent evidence that they'd reduce their drinking. Okay. And then the really key outcome, right? This was the whole point of MUP, was to improve health. Well, the primary evaluation study found a 13.4% reduction in alcohol-specific deaths and over 4% reduction in alcohol-specific hospital admissions. And that's 156 fewer deaths and 411 fewer admissions every year. Those are, pretty big numbers in a Scottish context. And the results were really impressively robust to all sorts of different alternative assumptions. So we really have confidence that those are, the best estimate that we can come up with. And there was less certainty around the impact on conditions where alcohol is just one of many risk factors, but overall the best estimate is 268 fewer deaths and nearly 900 fewer hospital admissions each year. So pretty big impacts. But whose health improved? Well, the reduction in deaths were a bit bigger for men compared to women, the over 65s compared to younger people, and the most deprived 4 deciles of the population. So on the right there is the change in alcohol-specific deaths. At the top is more deprived. So you can see that the reductions were biggest, or in fact, they were only significant in the most deprived 40% of the population. So what that means is that the effect that we would expect that MUP reduces health inequalities is exactly what we saw, which is great. But not all health outcomes improved. Separate studies that looked at ambulance call-outs, prescriptions for treatments associated with alcohol dependence, emergency department attendance, level of self-reported dependence or health among drinkers engaging with treatment services, all found no clear evidence of any impact, either good or bad, when MUP came in. And there was limited impact on other outcomes. No clear evidence of a change in police call-outs or crime, conflicting and inconclusive evidence on road traffic accidents, no clear evidence of an impact on food purchasing or diet, although there was some evidence of a reduction in overall sugar consumption in more deprived households due to a reduced alcohol intake. Basically, people were buying less alcohol. There's lots of sugar in alcohol. So there was maybe a small bit of evidence of kind of a secondary dietary benefit there in terms of people consuming less sugar, but it was small. And then moving on to the impacts on the industry. Before MUP came in, the alcohol industry told lots of tales of woe about how there would be mass job losses, but actually there was no clear evidence of any job losses or other negative impacts on the industry. And the overall fall in sales volume was more than offset by the increase in sales value. But there were winners and losers. So, manufacturers of perry and white cider in particular did end up losing sales while beer manufacturers gained. But also in terms of retailers, so some small shop owners quite liked MUP because they felt that the policy had leveled the playing field, because supermarkets could no longer use their better buying power to undercut them on the basis of price. They had to sell at the minimum unit price, and the small shop owners could also do that. So they felt that meant that people were more likely to kind of pop round the corner to their local shop to buy some beer rather than to go to the supermarket. And then a few other possible side effects. There was very limited evidence of people driving across the border to England to buy alcohol, and those people were people who live near the border anyway. This was another thing that the alcohol industry said would definitely happen beforehand and basically didn't. There was no clear evidence of a negative impact on children, either through their own drinking or the drinking of others, for example, their family members. And the public broadly supported the policy, and that support increased after it was introduced, which is, reassuring, but slightly surprising maybe. But people liked it beforehand. When it came in and they saw what it actually did, they liked it even more. So to summarize, MUP matched or exceeded the pre-implementation expectations on the key outcomes, alcohol consumption and alcohol attributable deaths. And in spite of looking pretty hard, evidence of negative effects of the policy was extremely limited, with the exception, as I imagine Wolf will talk about in a minute, of the financial impact on some vulnerable drinkers with alcohol dependence. Okay, I'm just going to talk about now a few of the challenges that remain to MUP. So the evidence from Scotland has shown that a lot of the original criticisms of MUP, things like it's going to lead to people switching to illicit drugs, it's going to destroy the alcohol industry and so on, are just flat out wrong. Okay, but there are still a few important challenges. And so one of them is this idea that MUP is a tax on the poor. Okay, that was something that really got a bit of traction in the UK before MUP came in. And as I've tried to explain before, MUP is more directly targeted at heavier drinkers rather than poorer drinkers. And, many people on lower incomes drink very little, if at all. But there are substantial inequalities in alcohol harm. So people on lower incomes and lower socioeconomic groups do suffer much more alcohol harm. And so if you want to reduce those inequalities in harm, the only way to do that is to reduce the drinking in more deprived groups. So on the one hand, you could say it's unfairly targeting lower income groups. But on the other hand, if you want to reduce inequalities, that's what you have to do. So, I think that's a kind of really key sort of issue that I guess policymakers have to wrestle with. But if you want to reduce inequalities, then that's all you can do. And MUP is much more effectively targeted at heavier drinkers on lower incomes than tax increases. So if it's a choice between MUP or tax, MUP wins really clearly on this measure. And then the other key challenge here is this question of extra money going to the alcohol industry. So introducing MUP has increased spending on alcohol in Scotland, and the vast majority of this increase has gone to producers and retailers of alcohol, who may well invest it in doing bad things, right, rather than that money going to the government. And you could mitigate this by increasing taxes alongside MUP. So you kind of claw back some of that additional revenue, or you could maybe come up with more innovative solutions, things like let's introduce a kind of windfall profit levy on alcohol producers and retailers, or some kind of minimum excise tax, which is basically like a minimum unit price, but you do it through tax. But that's a little bit more complicated. No one has really done that, although we do have something similar for cigarettes in the UK. But it's kind of more of an interesting idea rather than the thing anyone has actually done. I'm just going to finish by talking about kind of the next steps. So this here, the blue line on this graph shows how since 2018, when MUP came into force in Scotland, that's disposable income. So disposable incomes, the amount of money that people have left over to spend on things like alcohol has basically not changed, right? Even the pandemic, the high levels of inflation that we've had in the last couple of years haven't really changed that. And disposable incomes have stayed pretty steady. But the MUP threshold in real terms, so after we adjust for inflation, has cratered, right? It's fallen by nearly 20%. Because it's not been indexed to inflation. It stayed at 50p. And so we estimate that alcohol consumption in Scotland is over 2% higher than it would have been if the MUP level had been inflated each year, been indexed to inflation. And so the MUP level would be 61p a unit today if all that had happened was it being increased in line with inflation. And so Scotland increased it to 65p last year. And a lot of people said, whoa, that seems really big. But actually, it's barely keeping pace with inflation. And so if they'd left it at 50p, there would have been a real risk that the policy's benefits that we have seen would have withered on the vine. So it's really important to, particularly in times of high inflation, to make sure that your MUP level is indexed to inflation. Okay, and that's all from me. So I'm going to pass over to Wolf.
Thank you, Colin. Thank you, Tina. Okay, so I'm going to try and cover a slightly greater focus on Wales and how does it compare to the rest of the British Isles. And as Colin's already said, I'm using the term British Isles because that's the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland. Have a look at the MUP story in Wales, what the implementation, evaluation and conclusions were. Most of that is positive bits, and I'll talk a little bit more about trying to look at and explore what happened in Scotland as a benchmark for Wales. I'm going to focus on some of the qualitative findings, which I think include some of the difficult bits that Colin's already alluded to. I'm going to then conclude by sharing the recommendations that we arrived at for the government, and an interesting set of recommendations that we also think applies to service providers or treatment providers, given the specific population that seem to have the most adverse effect in all of this. I've been doing this for a long time, like Colin, and I've got some personal reflections on spending 10 years in the MUP world, and I just want to share a couple of those. I think the interesting bit, and Colin has already shared some of this, and I don't want to repeat what Colin said, but the landscape across these different jurisdictions we're looking at is actually slightly different in terms of when they've introduced minimum pricing and at what levels they've introduced it at. I think interestingly, I think the two things really apply, as Colin said, that the retailers operate across the devolved boundaries, and it's an important thing always for us to understand, and that the tax level is retained at a UK level, and there was a slight change in that that's had some impact on prices a little bit later on, which is to do with the differentiated tax duty by bands. More interestingly, at a policy level, Scotland and the Republic of Ireland have had much more comprehensive public health legislation, which means excluding tax, they have actually had licensing and availability restrictions as well. I'm going to talk about Wales, which has the same sunset clause that Colin alluded to. Ours has to be renewed by March 2026, or it will come into effect. But it doesn't have any of the licensing or availability restrictions that take place in Scotland or Republic of Ireland. So devolution is not actually equal, even where we have devolution. There are some more complicated issues in Ireland, Northern Ireland, because of its overlap physically with Ireland, some impacts of Brexit and bits and pieces like that. And there is an argument, and McCambridge et al., and many have made it, that perhaps in Westminster, because maybe even the size of the market that Colin alluded to, that actually the influence of the alcohol industry is much greater over that government than it is the others. Such is the different nature of all of this, that the Welsh Government even chose to adopt a different terminology, and we stuck with that throughout the whole of our evaluation period. So if you do actually look at any of our reports, we kind of ended up using what the Welsh Government referred to as minimum pricing for alcohol, which is the policy, or what Colin was referring to as minimum pricing. And the Welsh Government also used it at some level because it was helpful to differentiate in their own policy statement from the Scottish. And yet in all of our work, we'll then talk about minimum unit pricing, as Colin did, which is the mechanism within the minimum pricing framework. And we were also then able to use it as a shorthand in reference to Scottish policy. So we even had this slight differentiation between the two, which was, I think, quite interesting and potentially a little bit confusing, but we stuck with it throughout the whole of our period, if you happen to read any of that. The Welsh evaluation and the Welsh implementation had slightly more complications at one level than the Scottish, or less so. So it followed behind Scotland and set it at the same price as Scotland. This was helpful at one level because Scotland was subject to a 4 or 5 year legal battle. And once it had gone through all of the legal battle and finally got to do the 50p through all of the courts, it was much easier for Wales to follow the 50p and not get renewed legal battles, which meant that Wales only had one very brief 3-month objection from Portugal and nothing else. The Scottish evaluation essentially for many of its periods, it came in 2018 and was able to do pre and post data all the way up to March 2018 without an impact of COVID. Welsh implementation came in March 2020 and was followed within 15, 16 days, something like that, of a complete comprehensive lockdown. And COVID-19, of course, had, if not more, impact on people's behaviour in relation to consumption, incomes, and availability of alcohol. there's some argument, and Colin's talked about the inflation period, but there's some argument for some, and I'll come back to this group in a bit, that what was known as, or what we get called in policy in the UK, a cost of living crisis, actually had a particularly ongoing impact through 2022, 23 on certain populations. Everything that's gone on in Wales has been in the shadow of Scotland, and that includes our evaluation. One of the early recommendations to Welsh Government, even before they implemented this, was to actually only do what they could. They couldn't afford to and didn't repeat the Scottish scale of evaluation. They didn't have the same spotlight on them as the Scottish evaluation. So one of the things that we were encouraged to do in our evaluation was to look for where there was resonance with Scotland. Could we see the same things going on in Scotland? And the headline on that, quite simply, is there was lots of resonance in the Welsh evaluation with what went on in Scotland. So much of what Colin has described actually could be seen in one form or another in Wales. The Welsh evaluation was a much smaller evaluation fund. It's a much smaller level of evaluation activity, therefore, and it's a much smaller government office in Wales than the big Public Health Scotland body that undertook all the work in Scotland. As I've said before, more limited policy levers, so no ability to affect promotional things like multi-buying discounts, and no effect on licensing hours. And again, Colin talked about the price that it comes into effect, and because it was a later price introduction than even in Scotland, the notion of the perhaps 44% that Colin identified was already slightly less within Wales, although we still had some of this argument that we could look at the natural experiment in comparison with England. The evaluation itself, I don't want to say too much more about it, except for that it did contribution analysis. Again, very theory of change driven, like Colin said. We did have one pre-implementation study. The Welsh Government and the raising in the Senedd, our Parliament, was particularly concerned with the idea that people might switch to other drugs. And again, without, we can jump straight to the headline there. Like in Scotland, we certainly didn't find any evidence of wholesale alcohol users becoming heroin users or cocaine users, all of that sort of stuff. I'll say a little bit more about the nuance of that a bit later. We did have longitudinal studies that tried to, like some of those studies in Scotland. So some longitudinal work in Scotland, and then there was some cross-sectional work, but most of the work in Wales was actually longitudinal. We had one immediate post-COVID impact study, as you can imagine, because of what happened very soon after it was done. We had one public attitude study, and there was some reinforcement of all of those messages that Colin talked about the study being quite the policy being quite well liked by people. In the end, there were 13 published reports, some journal articles, and our publication final report is a very recent one. So I'm talking about something that's literally only been published in the last 2 months. So what can we say about the key findings in Wales? Exactly the same as Colin says: retailer compliance and effective enforcement, no problem at all. We did 3,000 license enforcement studies in the first year. Some required a second nudge back, and out of the 3,000, only 6 led to any kind of fine or action with retailers not complying. So high levels of compliance were able to be evidenced. Cheapest alcohol products essentially disappeared, and exactly as in Scotland, predominantly the white cider was the main product that disappeared. We did have some shifts in promotions. So whilst in Scotland multi-buying disappeared because it wasn't allowed in their other piece of legislation, let alone the effective minimum price, in Wales, minimum price did able to counter some of the multi-buys that applied across England and Wales, that over time some of those receded. So in our last wave of evaluation, we could see some multi-buys return where they weren't there originally. Some of the same could be said about the shift in products. So we saw the ABVs, some of those have remained. We saw, as we did in Scotland, introductions of some 50 centilitre bottles rather than the standard 70 centilitres, but that seemed to be a bit temporary, and then a return to the more standard 70 centilitre bottle size. So all of those sort of things. Evidence, as in Scotland, a decline in sorry, that should say purchasing as a proxy for consumption. I've just realized that error in that slide. And we saw some of that. And we also saw a shift, again, alluded in some of Colin's data, perhaps shifts from ciders to either wines and or spirits, and just because spirits, by then, the price is the same per unit. Some of that stuff, therefore, is lots and lots of resonance with Scotland. No problem at all whatsoever. The concerns about the negative consequences, the predicted stuff from the beginning, really wasn't materialized in the same way as people talked about before the policy came in place. And again, mirroring a little bit of what happened in Scotland, very limited evidence of crime or shoplifting, except for the tiny population I want to talk about in a minute. Certainly no mass evidence of people switching to heroin or other drugs. There was a little bit of evidence of some increased drug use, and this would come out in certain studies. And we need to be clear that this was specific to those who were already using drugs. So minimum unit price would not necessarily cause any initiation of drug use, but those very heavy users that were switching already between drink and drug use might then use slightly more drugs and slightly less alcohol, depending on what was the most cost-effective available to them. The cross-border shopping, like Colin said, didn't take place. We saw a slightly, probably evidence of a slightly greater volume of it, and certainly heard a lot more greater volume of it in the qualitative data. But then Wales has 2 or 3 populations that literally border England in a way in which the same does not really apply in Scotland, except for one small population in its southeast. And therefore people were already doing their supermarket shopping in England, and therefore would pick up alcohol in those instances. And it's just a large number of people doing that activity. But same point, if you then went deeper into Wales or further away from England, no one was going on booze cruises, inverted commas, to England to particularly pick up. Exceptions might be the odd wedding or something we heard of, but nothing more than that. We heard no evidence of white van sales, or and 1 or 2 tiny bits in some of the qualitative data about people alluding to there's certain odd shops that you could get under the counter sales, but none of that actually matched the evidence that came from compliance or retailer data or licensing data. So very little of those particular negative consequences occurring. Strong resonance for Scotland, which is the most important thing, which was what we were seeking to do, to say, can we trust what's going on in Wales, and is it similar to what's going on in Scotland? And essentially, does this measure work in the same way in Wales as it does in Scotland? And the simple answer to that question is yes. And then, maybe because we had a much higher proportion of qualitative work in the Wales evaluations, we did have this big and. Those on low incomes and who are drinking very large volumes certainly evidenced that MUP initially, whether or not it was the more wider financial period over time, further struggles in maintaining their finance. And I want to concentrate on that a little bit more, because in the period following our final evaluations, it's this particular finding, as opposed to all of the positive stuff, that's grabbed the headlines. And so it's important to hear that, and we're just beginning to work out how we respond to that in terms of So in the qualitative data, we heard essentially quite a lot of difficulties for what we could paraphrase as low-income dependent drinkers. So exactly as Colin suggested, inevitably those who are drinking the most, accessing the cheap white cider, looking for the cheapest products before MUP and then continuing to do so afterwards. And they had real difficulty in maintaining the affordability, was frequently echoed. It was just getting harder. Their response to it, and what we unpicked in detail in the qualitative data, was that they would tend to extend existing coping mechanisms. In other words, they were already low-income dependent drinkers and therefore trying to maximize not very much of an income on prioritizing alcohol, and they continued to prioritize alcohol. And the way in which they did that extended the mechanisms they were already doing. Those essentially would be going without food or, spending less on food, less on other goods. We had all sorts of interesting quality examples, about people, having not bought any new clothes or underwear for a year or 2 years or stuff like that. And in some instances, not paying bills or delaying paying bills or getting to arrears with bills, particularly household bills, and or 1 or 2 people rent as well associated with housing. As I alluded to in the last slide, for this particular group, rather than the wider population, some expressions of shoplifting, maybe slight increases in shoplifting. The shoplifting itself was very much trying to shoplift alcohol. And we've seen in Wales 1 or 2 places now where alcohol is slightly harder to shoplift, not just tags, but potentially behind glass screens and stuff like that. But not in the way in which shoplifting is rife in crime and associated with drug use. This is not people going into shops and lifting any products that they can then go and sell on a black market to then turn into cash to then go back into the shop to buy alcohol. It's not that sort of thing you see with drug users, but some extent of shoplifting alcohol. As I said before, some evidence in this group of switching to drug use, but very specifically, even within this low-income dependent drinking population, only those who had already been previously using drugs. In other words, those who already had it as an existing coping mechanism. It wasn't one people. And in all of the qualitative evidence, we'd hear these things being said, and they were being said, obviously, post introduction of minimum price. There were these other external factors going on, and it was not easy always to be 100% convinced that what we were being told was exclusively an issue of the minimum pricing rather than some of the other factors. But we heard it consistently enough that it had to be reported. And then something slightly interesting as well. When people were really pushed in some of the qualitative data, you could get a slight sense that some of these low-income dependent drinkers, either through their tale or what the treatment providers were telling them about their drinking, was that there might have been the tiniest reduction in their drinking as well, but no change in a sense of dependency or being treatment seeking. So if you're drinking 160 units, maybe they'd come back out at 140 or 130, or it would only be a bottle and a half of vodka a day instead of 2 bottles, that sort of thing. But even so, as a sense of a small reduction within that context. Okay, so to finish off then, really, what were the recommendations and what my reflections? For the Welsh Government, pretty straightforward for us in a sense that given the fact that it's the only measure available to them in the context of devolution, that they would be madness not to retain a policy measure that clearly demonstrates obvious results and resonates with the evidence practice. If they want to maintain its value, then they should rise the price, but we're very clear to qualify that's a political decision, not an evaluator or researcher's decision. There remains a need to continue to communicate effectively about the policy and who it's for. And given that there's quite a lot of public reception for that, doesn't see any reason why that shouldn't do. If the policy is continued, they have to pay attention to the effect on specific populations. And really the requirement of other policies here, and we've talked a lot to them about the fact that actually if the negative effect is on the low-income treatment-seeking populations or dependent populations, then you must have really robust alcohol treatment policies. They must be really accessible, etc. In the context of using minimum unit pricing. We suggested that if they carry on, some next steps might include some continued evaluation or monitoring, and maybe focusing on some of the explicit populations that are adversely affected rather than all populations. And one or two of the groups that haven't really had enough attention either in the Scottish or the Welsh stuff, and particularly by that we might be talking about families and children. And given everything you've heard from Colin and that you've heard from me, we made a very bold statement in the final evaluation that we really think that you can't look at. So Colin said the only way was about introducing minimum unit pricing, but the other ways to actually address inequality in health and social outcomes is really have a look about actually how you reduce social and health injustices. Difficult for a Welsh government or a Scottish government when some of that remains in the power of the Westminster government. But we're really asking them to look at that and look at this policy in that context very overtly rather than perhaps implicitly. We did decide at the end of it that we needed to make some recommendations for service providers, really. One for the government, that they need to better communicate with them, that this policy is likely to create knock-on effects for a treatment-seeking population. We think the treatment seekers or service providers must actively engage much more with the experience of the individuals they engage with around matters of finance and housing and so on and so forth, and not really just think about the process of getting them off alcohol without thinking, oh, what's the cost of that? But also having a much more honest conversation with them that this is a financial experience for them. It's not just a chemical experience. And given what this specific population do, we think they need to be much more clearer in offering explicit harm reduction advice about the potential of switching from one alcohol product to another. In other words, what happens when you switch from cider to, say, spirits, or what happens when you switch from alcohol, say, to cannabis or heroin. And they need to be far more explicit in engaging in that work. And then finally from me, there was definitely more support than not. There's a consistent dislike of the cheap products. There's a lot of belief in protecting future generations. There's a belief in the evidence and lots of belief generally in the World Health Organization best buys, lots of acknowledgement of needing to reduce the demands. And we might talk about this a bit later, but there's something about Wales wanting to do something it's keen control of and not just coming from the Welsh government. Like Colin, there was lots of conversations about it being an unfair or a tax on the poor. For the treatment drinking population, you consistently hear that minimum unit pricing won't stop people drinking. Maybe it's never designed to do that rather than cut it down. And then we've had one or two particular pieces of critique from what I would regard as alcohol-related stooges, and we've been called supporting zombie policies, putting lipstick on a pig, all sorts of things like that. And you can read about some of that stuff if you want to. And my final reflections is that contribution analysis and theory of chain methodologies are brilliant for this. So yes, as Colin's alluded to, evaluating minimum unit pricing is really messy. It involves lots and lots of different things, and therefore you want a complicated methodological approach. There are lots of challenges in communicating the nuance under the core headlines. For the poorest in our society, 2015 to 2025, life is just getting tougher. There's no doubt about that. And the coping mechanism, of course, therefore, is increasingly attractive. I have realized the need for more comprehensive policies, and we can't just have alcohol pricing and availability and licensing policies without thinking about the injustice and treatment policies. So governments need to do all of the policies. A good friend of ours from Northern Ireland, a consultant psychologist who's done lots and lots of work in alcohol, has always told me to be cautious of the zealots. And I've begun to realize there are actually lobbyists on both sides. And if we're going to continue to talk about the alcohol industry as lobbyists, then maybe we need to be a little bit honest about, think about, is Montevendi, for example, an abstinence-based policy lobbyist as well? And do either of the lobbyists actually satisfy the people in the middle? And then there's been a brilliant recent paper by James Nichol that I'd really encourage people to read, which is the elephant in the room for all of the evaluators and all the policymakers, is that somehow we keep doing all of our work without recognizing that the majority of the population just take pleasure in their drinking. And if we don't have an honest conversation with them that also accounts for that, then many of our messages are getting lost. So I'd recommend that recent paper to people as well. Okay, I think that will do for me, Tina. Thank you.